Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in the next expansion of World of Warcraft Shadowlands, a lot of abilities that classes used to have are going to be coming back. It begs the question, what other abilities are we going to be seeing with the release of Shadowlands? And in this video, I wanted to take a deeper look at some of the artifact weapon abilities from Legion to see if any of those abilities could have any merit to come back for Shadowlands. The artifact weapons from Legion introduced a lot of active abilities, but also a lot of passives that changed the way that we play the game. And for the longest time in Legion, they were the biggest impact to how our classes played. Could some of those passives as well as active abilities come back to the game, and which one of them might have a merit to come back to? In this video, I'm going to give you guys my top 10 favorites as well as some honorable mentions. At number 10, a lot of druids will remember Mark of the Shifting, which was part of the Restoration Druid artifact weapon ability. While in travel form, cat form, moonkin form, or bear form, you heal for 1% of your maximum health every 3 seconds. Now this ability on its own was pretty busted back in PvP, as a lot of restoration druids would literally turtle, but rather bear, the brunt of the damage by popping into bear form with all the healing over time and just run around healing themselves every second. Now, I kind of like the idea of when you are inside of a form that you are passively healing. We actually have a couple different classes that already have a passive healing effect. Restoration druids would love this, but also feral druids as well as boomkins I think would appreciate a talent like this to give themselves a little bit more sustainability while being able to sit in their damaging forms and put out more damage. Back in Legion, this trait was very strong for Restoration Druids, and I feel like if Blizzard were to bring this back, they could even adjust the number in terms of just how much healing there is to make sure this ability is way not too balanced out. But I think it would be kind of cool to play a feral druid and without having to always spend a global to heal yourself with the regrowth, having something like Mark of Shifting on somewhere in your talent rows, let's say compared to other talents that are not as good in terms of defensive tree, I think something like this could totally come back in the game. At the number 9, I put Dense Concoction. This is an ability a lot of Assassination rogues will love, as this was one of the abilities we got further into Legion. Dense Concoction reads, Crimson Vial reduces the damage you take by 4%, increasing by 4% every 1 second. So for the duration of your Dense Concoction, you would have this buff that would stack up every time the heal ticked. So at the end of the ticks for your healing vial, you would have about 4 to 5 seconds of 24% damage reduction. What I personally like about this ability is, well, every rogue loved it because it gave you extra survivability. Assassination had this extra dense concoction, and you could time Crimson Vial with some of the cooldowns from their enemies, or even use this ability prematurely in order to give themselves a little bit extra tankiness when it comes to working through some of the dungeons and raid content where you're going to take a lot of damage. I put this ability on this list not because I feel like dense concoction should come back, although if it does, it'd be awesome to see it somewhere on the talent row, but it would be cool to add more talents that allow abilities to have an extra effect. One of the things that I love about Legion is how they allow the heal to also become a defensive if timed right, so now this ability has more than one usage for it, allowing the player to decide how they want to use the ability. In the same breath as number 8, we will have ourselves Feet of Wind, which is a marksman hunter trait from Legion at a later stages of the game. This ability is very similar to how Dense Concoction works, but it allows an ability that's usually a movement to become a powerful defensive. Aspect of the Cheater grants you 50% dodge chance and makes you immune to snares. For marksman hunters, this was actually quite good. It allowed the ability of Aspect of the Cheetah, at least in PvP, to become a defensive-based ability. And I could totally see certain marksman hunters try to use Feet of the Wind with the dodge chance for Aspect of the Cheetah to cheese certain mechanics instead of dungeons and raids. Normally, Aspect of the Cheetah allows hunters to have a momentary sprint on a 3-minute cooldown, which seems like a lot. This compared to Rogue's Sprint, which for a few seconds gives you flat movement speed increase. Instead, Aspect of the Cheetah has this massive sprint part of it for first few seconds, and then kind of like a jog for the rest few seconds of this ability usage. But after they introduced this trait into the game, Aspect of the Cheetah became quite a good defensive ability. And yes, it only had 50% chance to dodge certain abilities, making you also immune to snares was quite valuable. And when dealing with melee characters attacking you, whether it's NPCs inside of a dungeon or rogues and warriors assaulting you, you are able to use Aspect of the Cheetah as an extra defensive. Again, I'm a huge fan of abilities having more than one usage. In the number 7, every feral should remember this ability, Protection of Ashman. When you shapeshift out of cat form, you gain 100% increased dodge chance and armor for 5 seconds or until you shapeshift back into cat form. A lot of ferals use this ability in PvP against other melee in order to give themselves a little bit extra protection. Like a feral could technically shapeshift out of cat form into human form, gain themselves regrowth as well as other healing over time abilities, while dodging all the melee assault from the enemy team. What how strong demon hunters are with the ability of Blade Dance, being able to use it in certain dungeon situations, I feel like Protection of Ashman could potentially be an awesome ability for ferals to get, maybe as a defensive, or maybe for all specs of Druid as maybe a talent option. If anything, I feel like this could be a very interesting choice for the Honor talent system. There's also a possibility for Blizzard to modify it so it doesn't come back in exactly how Protection of Ashman used to work, but maybe in a slightly modified version. Maybe reduce how often you can use this ability or the duration of the buff or how potent the buff is to maybe like 75% of effectiveness. But I feel like this ability has a lot of playability. The next ability on number 6 is going to be Juggernaut. This was a Fury Warrior artifact trait, where executes increase the damage dealt of your executes by 3% for 8 seconds, stacking up to 99 times. This meant that Fury Warriors needed to spam out executes during execute phases of the fight, where the enemy has 20% or less health, and try to see, back in Legion, if they could ramp up the damage to incredibly high numbers. I'm a huge fan of massive numbers, and the fact that you can stack Juggernaut to 99 times at 99 stacks times 3% extra damage for each execute, I feel like you could have some very fun gameplay to it. Very fast-paced gameplay where you're able to ramp more damage instead of like a boss fight where at the very start most classes ramp up to really high damage. Instead, you ramp during the downfall of the boss. Of course, Blizzard could modify this because you don't have executes as an ability that has no cooldown and uses rage, but for Fury Warriors right now, rather, it does have a cooldown and uses no rage. Instead, it actually generates rage, so it should be a lot easier to play with. But Juggernaut could be designed in a way where a Fury Warrior, if they're skilled well enough with their spec and is able to sync as many globals of executes back to back, maybe with a very narrow window of increasing the damage of your next execute, it could create some fun playstyle and mechanics where certain other stats could be prioritized, like haste, over something that Fury Warriors go for right now, like crit. I feel like it could be a very fun mechanic where you could get some massively high numbers, which could be fun in its own wake, but also there's some playability that could be added to the fast-paced Juggernaut that is the Fury Warrior. At number 5, I decided to go with the Mark of Elune artifact ability for Arcane Mages. I feel like Arcane Mage as a class simply just doesn't have enough abilities. And yes, while they can do a lot of damage with the little that they are given, I feel for a class with so much potential for the Arcane to always just cast Arcane Blast and Arcane Missiles and Arcane Barrage, I feel like more abilities could be added into your playstyle where you could do more damage. Mark of Elune was a really cool ability from back in Legion, and one of the things it did, which I very much liked, is it played around your mana. Mark of Elune would put down a rune on an enemy that would tick down in damage and then explode, doing damage to the target and anybody around them. So it had this single target / AoE component. And the damage of the detonate would be equal to 20% of your maximum mana. I feel like Arcane Mage mana management is a gold mine that Blizzard could find a way to explore and find ways to make meaningful playstyles out of it. I feel like there's so much potential to the mana management playstyle that Arcane Mages could potentially have that it could be very, very interesting if they found a way to combine it. So let's say your abilities do damage based on percentage of your mana, or certain abilities spend mana but others restore it. So you have to have this fluctuation of mana management using a bar, kind of very similar to how Rogue uses common points and energy. And I feel like Mark of Elune could be one of those abilities that could come back since it does play off of your mana. Plus it gives Arcane Mages an extra ability to press, which is never a bad thing. Number 4 on the list is going to be my all-time favorite artifact weapon ability, Thalkael's Consumption, which was a Demonology Warlock ability back in Legion. On a 45-second cooldown, 2-second cast, Thalkael, which was the artifact weapon for Demonology Warlock, drains 8% of life from all of your active demons and servants. and unleashes a blast of shadow damage equal to the health stolen. The shadow damage the artifact weapon would do would rival Chaos Bolts from Destro Warlocks. The better your pet management was, the more pets you can get out on the table all in the same time to maximize the use of this ability, the more damage you did, which in the current playstyle of how Demonology plays in Battle for Azeroth, where you play around a Tyrant demon that you summon that extends the duration of all your active demons in the moment, I feel like this ability coming back maybe as a talent option or a base ability for Demonology could be quite interesting. Right now, Demonology Warlocks play a playstyle where once you summon the Tyrant, he sacrifices the health of all the imps to empower a massive Tyrant to blast at your foe. And the Tyrant is always going to do more damage than 8 or 9 imps, so he's always going to be the priority. But Demonology Warlocks before this pet sacrifice playstyle had a playstyle where they would try to summon as many pets as possible, summon the Tyrant to extend the life of all your active pets at the time, and have this massive army blasting your enemy for about 15 seconds while they also do more damage. But since that playstyle simply doesn't do enough damage, right now everybody plays the playstyle where you simply get a massive Tyrant. Instead of having an army of demons, you now have one massive demon. But Daily Chaos consumption would allow Warlocks that are able to manage the amount of pets and timers all in the same time to summon a massive Tyrant to extend those timers, sacrifice the health of all the pets they have, and bring back that massive army of demons playstyle that I imagined from back in the day. I feel like it's a much harder playstyle to play, it's a lot of things to manage all in the same time, but it'll be so rewarding for any players that are able to play it just right. And having guaranteed burst damage based on how well you can manage all of your pets will always be good for PvE and PvP. Number 3 on this list isn't going to be a specific ability, but I had to put something there. So I decided to put Master of Combinations, but any ability in the same vibe is something that I would want to see back in the game. Master of Combinations is a Windwalker trait. Every time you trigger combo strikes passive, you have a chance to grant mastery to you and extra allies for 6 seconds. Now, there are some traits in the game for Battle for Azeroth that have a similar effect. The mages, particularly those with fire, have a trait called Wildfire, where once you use combustion, you do give crit to some allies, but that's not really a common thing that we see a lot of classes give off. This is a buff that can be applied to your allies. It's a utility ability that allows your class, no matter who you are or even certain specs that might be underperforming, to bring something to the table. In Battle for Azeroth, Blizzard decided to give certain classes back a raid buff and debuffs. So every one of those classes is a must-have inside of a raid group. But let's say your class or your spec doesn't bring anything extra or special to the team. Let's say a survival hunter. Most people look at survival hunters and they don't really take them seriously, even if you're someone who dedicates your time to playing survival and getting the best gear. But what if survival had a buff, very similar to Master of Combinations that we talked about, that could be provided for your group or a raid? Let's say every time they did something cool that their class does in order to do the most amount of damage, or the present ability that's part of their utilities, you provide everybody around you some sort of a buff. Crit buff, haste buff, versatility, mastery, it almost doesn't matter because any buff will be useful to your team. I feel like this is something Blizzard could do for any of the classes that are lacking something extra that they bring to the team. To be able to provide a momentary buff of certain stats to your raid or party could be quite good. Imagine if you're playing a sub-rogue and no raid has a reason to bring a sub-rogue when they can bring an Assassination or an Outlaw for any of the boss damage. But let's say sub-rogues bring mastery to the team, that means now the raid has a spot for a sub-rogue if they want to, because that mastery buff can go a long way for some of the tanks, maybe the healers, and maybe other DPS. I feel like bringing momentarily shareable buffs based on base class mechanics could be a way for Blizzard to alleviate a little bit of the struggle of having to balance all the classes. And of course, certain classes and specs are going to be stronger than others. So you got to give players a reason to bring some of the lesser played specs because of something unique that they might bring to the team. In the number 2, I'm going to go with Light's Wrath. This was my utmost favorite ability, and if they were to bring back Light's Wrath, I would want to bring back that chance for it to overheat as well. Light's Wrath was a Disciplined Priest damage ability. and Discipline Priest in Legion became more of a damaging / healing class, which was something that we're seeing right now from Disc Priest in BFA. Light's Wrath would draw upon the power of your artifact weapon and deal a boatload of spell damage, and the damage would be stronger the more atonements you had on your allies. So if you had a group of 40 players and you would put up 40 atonements, that means the damage would be increased by 40%. The ability itself also had a chance to overheat, like the artifact weapon would actually glow with as if it's about to explode, and then if you were to use Light's Wrath, the ability itself would do something like, what, 200% more damage? So the hilarious numbers you could do in some epic battlegrounds as a Disc Priest, where you could just actually one-shot an enemy after providing all your allies an atonement buff after your artifact weapon was overcharged, was hilarious. Besides the hilarity that Light's Wrath brought, it also was a great utility ability for all of your allies. If there was an enemy that needed to be nuked, Disc Priest had this massive button for it. If your allies were in trouble and needed insta-cast heal on a moment's notice, Light's Wrath could be used in order to bring everybody back up to speed. With how Disc Priest has been playing as of recently, it's more of a predictive spec. You have to know what the fight entails, and being able to react to different parts of the fight can be quite difficult on Disc. But Light's Wrath could be one of those abilities where you could have atonement spread all over your allies. Everybody takes massive damage, and Light's Wrath is able to get everybody back up to speed in a quick moment's notice. What I like about this ability, like a lot of other abilities, is they have more than one use for it. Yes, it could be used simply for damage, it could be used for healing, but depending on how player chooses to use this ability, can create value in any situation. We got some honorable mentions before we go over number 1. Some of the honorable mentions that I wanted to put on here, but I didn't. First of all, Stolen Power, which is another Demonology Warlock ability, which I feel like something like this should totally be in the game, maybe not just for Demonology. Back in the Legion, however, Stolen Power would make it so when your Wild Imps cast Firebolt, you gain an application of Stolen Power, and after you reach 100 applications of Stolen Power, your next Shadow Bolt or Demon Bolt will do extra damage. With the playstyle the Demonology Warlocks have right now, to be able to empower a massive Demon Bolt to basically Chaos Bolt the enemy, I think could be quite good, and could promote different playstyles where you don't necessarily have to sacrifice all of your little imps. Next ability on this list, and I had to mention this, the Retribution Paladin Unbreakable Will. Now, I know a lot of people hated this ability back in Legion, unless you were a Retribution Paladin, but seeing a Red Pally just be able to get out of CC on a 2-minute cooldown was insane. When unable to act in combat for more than 2 seconds, Ashbringer will break you free. Can only occur every 2 minutes. So this ability was an extra trinket for free for paladins. It was busted, but something like this maybe could come back in replacement of maybe some of the honored talents that we have for paladins, maybe be an extra defensive that protection and holy could also use in certain boss fights. But of course Blizzard could balance it, but bring something like this back to the game because it was so busted, but also because it was so fondly remembered by paladins. Another honorable mention for me would be Crystalline Swords, not because this ability actually changed anything. Basically, Frost Death Knights had a chance on attacks to create Icebringer and Frost Reaper, which were their artifact weapons from back in the day. So you created a copy of those weapons that floated around you. I feel like there's not enough abilities in the game that allow weapons to kind of float around the Death Knight. Only Blood Death Knight has a runic weapon that floats and fights with you. But I feel like something like this would be cool thematically for the Frost Death Knight, as I always viewed them to be a combination of a warrior but a mage. So having floating weapons to have this like spell cleaver type of playstyle, and I feel like this ability just simply thematically is super cool, and I remember it pretty fondly, but maybe Blizzard could bring it back as an actual viable talent in place of some of the other talents that maybe nobody ever uses. The number 1 ability that I would want to bring back from Legion artifact weapons would be the Blood Death Knight trait, Vampiric Aura. Consumption, which is your artifact weapon ability, now grants 20% leech to you and 4 allies for 15 seconds. Inside of dungeons, Blood Death Knights were king, and this ability definitely helped them provide a little bit extra utility to the party. Not only did it have a cool thematic aspect, as Blood Death Knights were basically like vampires of World of Warcraft, they leech the soul and life force of their enemy, but to be able to provide this momentary leech vampiric buff to their allies as well was very, very cool for back in the day. It even allowed certain playstyles where you could play with a bunch of DPS that had a lot of leech gear, and you would use Vampiric Aura from time to time in order to deal with some of the high damage situations that bosses would sometimes put you into. It was a very cool ability for Blood Death Knights to bring something to the table that your allies could use, and I feel like we need more of those abilities where we have more ways to interact with one another inside of various parts of World of Warcraft content. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed. It took me a little bit of research as a lot of the databases for the artifact weapon stuff are a little bit slower, and it is a lot of research to go through every single one of the trait, but I decided to go with the ones that are remembered fondly. I'm pretty sure that I missed a few from any of the specs that you guys might have played back in Legion. So if you want to write me down in the comments below which traits would you want to come back from maybe some of the classes you used to play back in Legion, you're more than welcome to. But I decided to go over some of the ones that are most gameplay impactful, but also some of the ones that I remember quite fondly. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see all of you in another video.